I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to the Thursday edition of Conversations with Al McFarlane. Today is Thursday, June 9th, 2022. And Thursday, I collect, work with, gather, convene a bunch of friends of mine, people that I know and have known for a long time that I respect. And we ask each other, what's on your mind? We talk about books we're reading. And today, to begin with, I have my colleague, my writing companion, Brenda Lyle Gray, in the studio. Brenda, how you doing?
I'm fine.
Good to see you. And Jonathan Palmer is here. Jonathan Palmer is the executive director of the Hallie Q Brown Community Center in St. Paul at the Martin Luther King Center on Kent Street. And Jonathan is one of the people in this community that is focused on serving our elders, our seniors, our workers, our frontline people, and youth. That's been the mission of the Hallie Q Brown organization for almost a century now, I think, close to it anyway. Jonathan, how you doing, man? Good to see you.
Doing pretty good, Al. Excited to be here and just talk about some of the great stuff that's going on.
Well, let's start with that. Let's take a minute and have you talk about Hallie Q Brown, kind of what's on your plate as an organization. And then I want to go into, you and I and Brenda and others that might join us talking about issues that we're concerned with, that we're watching in the country, in the community, around the world. I'm concerned about gun violence, for example. And I'm also concerned about the elections coming up, what we have to do to make sure that our voices, our positions are heard and our interests served. But Jonathan, talk about Hallie Q, first of all.
Thank you, Al. And just to reiterate, our organization is 93 years old, comes out of the settlement house movement, been in the heart of Rondo since 1929. So, and all the things you described is exactly who we are and what we do. So we've had some really good things happen lately. We just had our preschool graduation last week. Had 6 students graduate, had a nice ceremony to celebrate them and send them off into kindergarten in the right way and share with their families. We also had the grand opening of our culturally sensitive playground. We had gone in. One of the things that happens a lot of times and people don't realize is playgrounds are usually using wood chips so kids don't fall and hurt themselves. Well, the wood chips get caught in black hair. And to fall within the guidelines, a lot of times Black families have to have their kids' hair professionally done. So that means that either they don't get to enjoy playing out or they go out and something gets caught and the hair has to be done again and again and again, and that's really expensive. So we took off the wood chips, we replaced it with AstroTurf with cushioning underneath. So it's kind of like getting on a gymnastics mat. So the kids are thrilled. They loved it. We had some great support. XL came in with a large $30,000 donation to us about that. And we had others, Midwest One, Highway Credit Union, and the St. Paul Rotary, or Edina Rotary, I'm sorry, all to support us and do this. So we're really happy about that and some great things for the kids. We can finally take infants outside. So it's a great playground. We're working on launching a new program with our food shelf to help families have healthy meals. A lot of times our families are working 2 jobs and they got to pick up the kids, come home. The kids are tired. The parents are tired. There's not enough time to cook a healthy meal. And so they'll default to fast food or they'll default to microwave stuff. So we're working on a group that we're starting with as a pilot program to give out crock pots and recipes and teach them how to use the crock pots and the food that they need. They can get right from the food shelf. And so what this will allow families to do is start that off in the morning, go to work. When they come home, there'll be a healthy meal right there waiting for them. Very low key and easy to do. So trying to make a dent in some of the health related issues within our community and as well as the time related that helps families. So
Bravo on the crock pot. And the recipes, I love that.
Oh,
I had it.
and the other big thing is that we've just got Kayla Jackson, who's our archivist, is doing a phenomenal job. And we're going to be putting up on our website some of the links to our online components of our archive. So the Hallie Q Brown Community Archive is located here. It's serving as a repository for Rondo history, for Hallie Q Brown history, photos, artifacts, papers, and documents. Kayla is phenomenal. She is a young Black woman working in this field. There's about 3% of the archivist field is Black women. So she is very strong in the field, very good, and doing wonderful work. And you're going to see some of that online that people will be able to check out. And as we go further on, more services coming out of that. So those are the big things that we've got going on right now. It's preparing for summer and all the fun that'll come with that summer program and things like that.
Let me key in on your 6 students graduating from your preschool program, being ready now for kindergarten. Yesterday, we had on the director of Southside Family Nurturing Center, I think the name of the organization was. Great conversation with an organization that has a multi-year, decades-long history of providing service. I think they organized in 1974 out of Lutheran Church in South Minneapolis, but they were created to try to deal with trauma in that inner city urban community. And I mentioned to the director that, she wasn't here then, but I was here in the early 70s, and I know that vibrant neighborhood was one of the centers of change and reflected diversity before the language of diversity became popular. That's where populations were pushing up against each other, sometimes mingling in ways that are constructive and instructive and are communal, but sometimes in ways that reflect the society's ways, knowledge, and intention of keeping us divided and at each other's throat. And so it's a challenging community. And as we were speaking, she said that during the course of the interview, where her office is now, I think over on 24th, maybe in Chicago, I'll look to make sure. She said there was a gunshot fired that she heard while we were talking. And that yesterday, guns had been fired a block or so from where her building was, and children were being brought to the facility by the school bus to pick them up at their homes. And she went out and said, stay on the bus where you stay safe till we figure out what this is. But she talked about this whole challenge, of how we connect and provide both safe havens and nurturing strategies for children who are experiencing trauma. And it's not, trauma every now and then, but the environment is an environment that is trauma-packed, trauma-filled, in a sense, a trauma-infused environment. And I shared with her the work that a friend of mine has written. His name is George Halverson. He's the former CEO of what became Health Partners. It used to be Group Health Inc. And he wrote a piece that we're going to publish shortly called, he runs a group out of California called the Institute for Intergroup Understanding. And in May, he wrote a piece that the headline says, it's his blog, "We have no chance of closing the wealth gaps in America unless we help children get the right start in the first 3 years of life." That's what led me to bringing this to you, because you mentioned those 6 scholars that are graduating and being prepared to go to kindergarten. But in his article, he talks about things we've all heard about and discussed, and that is, the predictability. If children don't have the proper nurturing and get exposed to vocabularies that enable them to navigate life itself, that are rich and robust, and that are, in a sense, guided properly, they experience limits on their capabilities, and they experience likelihoods that that their futures can be predicted, and the prediction is dire. Lack of wealth, lack of standing, lack of opportunity, likelihood of jail or prison, and other things that, in a sense, are all reflections of this catastrophe of disparities that our communities face in the country today. So what I mentioned at the close of that, the 5 ideas he said are things that his essay goes really deep on child brain development. And he's saying that we have to really pay attention and be specific in organizing institutions and families, neighborhoods around the specific intent of nurturing brains. I mean, some people say, oh, that's a no-brainer. You're always using your brain. But he's saying it's not that simple, and that we have to really be intentional and intend to and do things that specifically focus on developing brains in children, and that we have to be intentional even before they're born, but particularly from 3 months old to 3 years old. And one of the things he said we should do more of is have books. That a lot of kids in our communities, and some communities, don't have access to books or enough books, and that even having books around would go a long ways in having a door open to, again, increased vocabulary, which he equates with increased opportunity. I'm going to scroll down here to the 5 things. He said, so what do we do now to help our children? We Americans need to do 5 things to help our children. We need everyone relevant to education in every single setting, and relevant to healthcare in every care setting, to understand the extreme importance of brain development in the first 3 months, in the first 3 years of life for every child. He says everyone in education in America should know and understand these issues, and it should be part of the culture, a belief system, and the direct foundation and context for all educators in America. Education is not just K-12 anymore. Education is clearly from birth on, and we know we should all know that the first 3 years determine who's going to be functional and capable in our high schools and in our universities, and also in our advanced educational settings. He goes on, and I'll paraphrase the last 3. We need to get books to every child. He explains why. Books are the most effective, easiest, and highest impact, short-term, medium-term, and immediate asset for each child and for each family. So we need every school board and every health site for kids to figure out ways of making books available to every child so they don't have those huge learning gaps in school. 4, we need to help every child who has fallen behind by age 4 with the kind of support that creates earning trajectories and learning trajectories and functional support for their lives. And 5, he says we should all recognize and understand that neuron connection process and the epigenetic dictated time frame is extremely important information at a foundational level. That's a lot. It's interesting. So I've asked several friends to look at this essay and read it, and hopefully in the next month or so, I'll have several people respond from their point of view on what this means to them. If they agree or disagree or have nuance or different analyses or different ways of looking at this. And, this obviously addresses the question of what those of us in Black and brown communities experience, but is there another framework or maybe there's not, another way of looking at this that examines the same outcomes that are negative, but says, in addition to this, other ways that can move us towards the proper resolution or solution. Just throwing it out. So, as a nurturer of children, what are your observations and what are your feelings about the role Hallie Q and other institutions in our community can and should and are playing in the development of our children?
Now, she's on 18th Avenue is where that building is.
18th, right? Okay.
And
2400 something, right?
Yeah, 2448 18th Avenue South.
Yeah.
And a beautiful old historic like
No
they
mention.
converted
Yeah.
a home or what. It's beautiful. Yeah, she was really heavy. I enjoyed her.
Mhm.
Passionate.
I think that everything you said is true, and there's even more. We actually talk about this every day, and we were talking this morning about some of our families, and we're constantly trying to think, what can we do more of? How can we help? Because we have students that come in with all sorts of issues. We have, one student that comes in that we know the parent gives them the iPad as soon as they leave here, and they have no idea what time the kid goes to bed. And he'll come in here and ask to lie down on the cot, and we'll sleep like 5 hours because
That's cool. Okay.
yeah, they get a space to do that. But there's other factors too. I mean, the part of the thing is food and hunger. I mean, there are so many families that deal with hunger, and you can't concentrate on education and learning if your stomach's rumbling. In our program, we give them breakfast and lunch and an afternoon snack, and we just try to take care and support that. But the issues that we're facing, and we're not the only one. Other centers like us do this too, or at least have the same issues. I don't think they necessarily take the same approach. Ours is very individualized to the families because Angie Gettle, who is the assistant executive director and the director of educational programs here, really takes that personal one-on-one. She knows all of those kids in her program. And so she can spot things that are happening and talk with the families. Families are really responsive. But we've got kids in here that their parents have committed violence against one another, that other people have come in, parents that some of them are in jail, or have drug issues, or just struggling with poverty itself. And so the kids come in here and they don't know how to express what's going on. And when they learn to, we work with them to do that, they may go to the school and the school doesn't know how to work with them around that. There's a framework that needs to be understood and changed across America, which is education is that first step. Education is that necessary step, but you can't do a cookie cutter thing. You have got to do trauma-informed care for families that have come up through trauma. If you're not addressing the trauma and how that child is feeling, they can't process the lesson that you're trying to teach them. If you're not sensitive to the environment that they live in, the environment they come from, you can't reach them in a way that is going to be meaningful because your experience does not resonate with them. There was a great test in the 70s, the Black Intelligence Test of Cultural Homogeny, and you can figure out what the acronym is yourself. But the main point of that was when you looked at students of color and white students, that oftentimes those standardized tests were skewed towards white upbringings, white processes, so that kids were getting answers wrong because it wasn't relevant to their community. You'd ask the question, pick the ball that's behind the couch, and that would be wrong, rated wrong. But if you say pick the ball that's behind the sofa, they would get it right. So there's a lot that is not understood about culturally specific language. And we're not even talking about slang. We're just talking about the terms that people use and the framework in which we approach it. Education has largely been approached from a white mindset. And what it needs to do is evolve into more of an intercultural mindset. So it's taking into account backgrounds. It's taking into account the ideas and the culture and the environments that people come from. People think that's a big, hard deal. It's actually not. We do that every day when we interact with people. It's how we're able to go about and be out in the community and visit somebody at a mosque or visit somebody at a temple or visit somebody within a cultural center and still be respectful and still be understood. So we have to do that. We have to go ahead and focus in and make sure those lessons are really being foundational for young people. We're giving them the great start that they need because that's what they deserve. And that's the thing that's going to be the greatest predictor of success. And we also need to make sure that they're safe in schools. And that's the big challenge we're facing right now. Looking at what is happening after Uvalde, after, all the other incidents that we've had over time. And the idea of us not being able to address this is absurd. And the fact that, we've got an overwhelming percent of the country that really does want sensible legislation, that wants to have the issue addressed, but 10 people can't sit down and figure out a way to come together on that. And largely, I'm going to say this, it's the conservatives who have misinterpreted and misunderstood Second Amendment all the way through. And the idea that the priority is owning a gun versus preserving life is absurd and hypocritical, especially when you consider Roe versus Wade. So.
Well, that's a great segue. I was mentioning the Southside Family Nurturing Center. My guest yesterday was Julie Ellison. She's the executive director of that. She's been involved in violence prevention and trauma-informed care for 28 years. It was a great conversation about children. And what she said, among many things, two things stood out for me. One was that if the society, the city, the country, state are serious about protecting children, then we have to make the investment. And that's the problem right now. If we're not willing to invest aggressively in creating the resources, the tools, and the supports that protect and nurture the development of every child, then by inaction, we are failing. We are defaulting to failure. Failure is the status quo. And she described that as the privilege that certain primarily white middle class people have and protect. And that is based on or is maintained at the expense of not providing it to people of color, Black and brown people. She also said, I think, Brenda, correct me if I'm wrong, that the thought I had is gone, but Brenda, jump in. I've got to go close the window because I think I'm getting noise from outside here. Brenda, what were your impressions of her presentation and maybe of what Jonathan said so far?
I thought she was very strong. I mean, we get real good interviews every day. And like I said, I'm learning from these people all the time, but she was really passionate. And, she might be a good connection, Jonathan, for Hallie Q. She's got some really good contacts, and it's this strong word of nurturing, that they've been doing this for, like, again, 1974. Mm-hmm. And I just kept saying, we all need nurturing. Because when I watch those hearings, it's like, where are we going as a country? But anyway, I wanted to mention to you that a way of getting free books is to check with the publishers, like Beacon Press and some of the children's publishers. If there is a scratch on a book cover, or if there is maybe a page that has a corner off, they can't sell it. So they have all of these books in their warehouses. And there's a young boy, Orion, I can't think of his last name. I did an article on it. He's the kid of the year. And he found 100,000 books that he goes around the country distributing to kids who are in disenfranchised communities. So I'll send you his name, because what you're doing at Hallie Q is exactly what Julie is doing with Southside, but also the fact of Halverson's ideal of these, and they especially need them in the summer, So I'll send you that contact. But I think you're doing wonderful, wonderful work at Hallie Q. And
A
What?
comment I made yesterday, and I'll share this again with you, Jonathan, I'll keep bringing it up, is so there's the practicality of Inside News, a community newspaper, a weekly. And what would it take to get institutions and schools in particular to be intentional about having children and parents and families in our community read the paper as a practice, as an intention? And so here's the why. I tell people that one of the reasons I'm in journalism is because when I was a kid in Kansas City, my dad would sit me at the kitchen table and say, read the newspaper to me. And so the Kansas City Star, afternoon paper, Kansas City Times, morning paper, he'd have them there, and on Sunday. And I'd sit and read, 4 or 5 pages or the whole paper. And as I read, he would, comment, primarily praising me for my ability to read. I read reflecting comprehension or saying what I didn't know, but there was an awareness in the reading. And that awareness he acknowledged and he nurtured by telling me how good I was and how good I sounded reading. And so I am and was so motivated by that adult in my life, my dad, praising this performance in me, that it set me on a path without me knowing it to be where I am today. And that is a person who has a relationship with the word, right? With I call myself a wordsmith. I understand language. I understand the power of the word of language. And so how do we create that so it's not just the Al McFarlanes and the Brendas who have these relationships with words as teachers and as writers, as authors, but we invest or nurture that relationship broadly in our community so that every household can be reading. Why is it important? So 2 things. One is that, the Black press of America has been one of the institutions, along with the Black church, the settlement house movement. They've been among the institutions that have provided a counterweight, protection, an umbrella against the incessant assault on our dignity and our humanity. We fought. And so there is this willingness of the colonizers, the proponents of white supremacist thought and power, to continue to cripple and disable, dismantle our defense systems. Anything that counters their point of view, their analysis, their story. Our job remains and has always been to create a different narrative, a story, an analysis that ends with, and we won. Our people won. We survived. We rose again, right? We prevailed. And that's not the story in the white press. The white press has an ongoing story about the pathology of our existence, right? Us as problems and them as solutions, but their solution is our incarceration and our marginalization, all to the consequence of them both managing and profiting from our brown, Black bodies, the misery that they nurture in us and around us as a business, right? So, and the first business was slavery. That was miserable, but that was their business, and that was our role in that. And things haven't changed that much on the one hand, but they have at the same time a lot because of our own agency. And we have been committed to changing. We know that the change that we ultimately pursue is a change that, by definition, must include changing them because they are the problem. And unless we change them, we can't fix us.
Right. And Black people have been stereotyped as lazy ever since we stopped working for free.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the truth is. We weren't called lazy when slavery was going on, but after slavery, suddenly lazy and shiftless and all of these things. But pre-slavery, we were in the house, we were warming up beds, we were cooking food. You don't do that to people who are shiftless and things. So the moment they don't have control of us, the moment they are not going ahead and setting what we do is when we become the problem. And that narrative gets created, and that's part of the thing that America has yet to fully confront, is the history within this country of oppression of not just Black people, of Native Americans, of Asian Americans, of Latinx, of all of the groups that come together. But I'm gonna just focus on Black because that's where most of my focus and history study comes from. You look at the fact that people discovered Juneteenth a year ago. 2 years ago, they discovered Tulsa. There is so much of the history and that is unknown because it isn't covered except by the Black press. And I'll tell you an interesting thing. When I was first doing research on Hallie Q Brown, who we're named for, pivotal figure. This woman this is one of those hidden figures of history that at the turn of the 20th century was traveling around America and Europe, talking about women's suffrage issues. She was a suffragette. She talked about civil rights issues. She spoke before the 1924 Republican National Convention. To be a woman at that time, and Republicans were different at that time. That was a different time where Democrats and Republicans were kind of reversed. But to be a woman and a woman of color and to be able to do that at the National Convention, that's unheard of. She represented the United States at the International Congress of Women in 1893 or 97. She did so much. She helped preserve Frederick Douglass's house in D.C. She started the Association of Colored Women's Clubs. Most people don't know about her. And the thing is when I started looking in research, I was going to, like the Strib's archives and everything. Nothing. Couldn't find anything about her. As soon as I got into the Black press, found out that as far back as 1890, she was coming to the Twin Cities every couple of years, speak at the Black churches, the Black social clubs. She was up here doing performances, doing public readings. And so the Black press has been the thing that has kept us informed, that has made sure that the truth gets out there. And the role that the Pullman Porters played in that, in terms of pre-internet, bringing newspapers from other parts of the country back to their different states. I mean, the Black press has been so integral in making sure we have information, which is the key. If you don't have information, if you don't have knowledge, you are going to be left behind. You will be duped into doing things. You can see that happening with the MAGA crowd. You will go ahead and fall into a place that you will not get out of. And so right now, as we're looking at this with kids, I don't know how many schools still have a school newspaper. How many of them are looking at that? And that's a project that is useful. Having kids do that, get connected in and learn about writing, learn about vocabulary. Everybody's into the technology now. So it's more, I'm going to watch this video and, here's my TikTok and that's great. But the fundamentals of reading, of knowledge, of research, that if people did research, we wouldn't have as many arguments on the internet as we do today.
And Jonathan, Al and I came up with one of the oldest Black newspapers with the Kansas City Call. They never failed to have a Black history article, and we knew what was going on in our neighborhoods. That was a big thing, Fridays, and our parents were looking for the call, and it's one of the oldest, isn't it, Al?
Yes.
I think so.
Yeah, it's one of the oldest, but it's one of the most powerful. But also, the spokesman recorder here in Minnesota is a legacy newspaper. The guy who founded it was like the dean of the Black community, Cecil Newman, and he was one of the creators of the NNPA, one of the organizers of the Black Press of America. And so these publishers, owners, were visionary, and they worked collaboratively across the nation to keep our communities informed. And the catchphrase was, "We wish to plead our own cause." And the idea is pleading not as begging, but pleading as demanding, as stating, as arguing our cause. arguing our point of view and challenging, speaking truth to power. So again, Jonathan, I would love to figure out, and I'll keep saying this till it takes root, how we figure out how to routinize, to create a protocol in Black families where families once again decide it's worthwhile and beneficial for children to read to their parents as an exercise in being together, exercise in monitoring. You, it's like you said, child comes to the center. He leaves the center and gets the iPad, right? And you know that he's probably on the iPad all night long without supervision, games or whatever, but then he comes to school tired, up all night. Right. And so how do we look at our responsibility to that child to redirect him or her so that there's balance in that life and capability? It's wonderful on the one hand that the child has the passion to focus so deeply, but the focus has to be nurtured, directed, and put into proper use. Otherwise, it becomes misdirected and counterproductive, I believe. So that's an idea, it's a thought. But you mentioned violence too, and we talked a bit before we started about the hearings that are unfolding, starting, the previews were last night, I thought. We heard several people testify. These were survivors and parents of children killed at both New York, at
Buffalo grocery store.
Yeah, and also in Texas. What do you think is going to come out of that attention to the Second Amendment? That's one thing, but then the hearings tonight, are hearings about January 6th. Not that they're connected, but they are, and it's certainly not disconnected, but they talk about the malaise abroad in the country right now. What are your thoughts about that, Jonathan and Brenda?
I
lost you towards the end now.
Just what are your thoughts about what we heard on last night when the families testified about the gun violence that they suffered? And there was one person, a Black woman, you might not have seen it, who came on talking about her Second Amendment rights, and she had lost a son at the shooting in New York. Brenda, you might remember that.
Mm-hmm. And she just felt that it was all tied into mental health. And I'm saying it could be Ramos and whoever the other guy was. There could be a problem, but he still walked into a gun store and got 1,000 bullets. I mean, if he didn't have those bullets in that gun, those kids wouldn't be dead right now.
If he didn't have the gun.
So mental health could be a problem. I go along with that, especially with Sandy Hook. But it's still gun. And didn't Remington go bankrupt from Sandy Hook? From the didn't they file a lawsuit and there's no longer Remington guns?
I think they're still around, but no, they have to pay a lot of money. That's what I know.
I mean, somebody's got to hurt. Trump has to hurt somehow. But somebody's got to hurt for the deaths of these innocent children.
And I tweak that a little to say somebody. I know where you're going, but I don't want somebody to misinterpret it. Somebody has to face justice,
right,
for what has happened, and for the allowance of the prevalence in our culture. And I had an interesting idea. I'm researching this to see if this would work. But the idea of the U.S. Consumer Protection Agency, I mean, it is really interesting when you look back in the history. I think it's the Consumer Product Safety Commission that actually banned lawn darts. you remember does anybody remember lawn darts? Were this game? It was like horseshoes, but instead of throwing a horseshoe around a pole, you threw a weighted dart into a hoop. And I had them. And between 1978 and 86, they caused 3 deaths and over 6,100 injuries. And so they got banned. They can't be sold in the country. And the interesting thing is they actually were developed out of an ancient weapon. There used to be a weapon the Greeks and Romans had that basically taking those and dropping on people's heads. But you can't buy those because of the safety issue. So why aren't we applying that same logic towards guns, especially AR-15s? You know, that when you look at the assault rifles and the idea that we need to keep them because people deserve to have them, which again is a misinterpretation of the Second Amendment. But the idea that people need to have them so they can shoot at varmints versus the fact that people are dying. Like, Al, you know I love comic books. You know I love superheroes and comic books. I got a room full, and there's somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 comic books in that room. And that has been with me my whole life. If somebody tomorrow came up and said, you know what, comic books are poison, and everybody who touches them, you know, kids, any kid under the age of 10 who touches them will die, I would stop buying comic books. I would be okay with them cutting out comic books because the greater good takes over.
Life.
The needs of the many must outweigh the needs of the few. And the idea that with all of the options you have in terms of guns, with the whole variety that you can choose from, that we can't limit one. We can't limit one style. That is insane. And that shows how much people are bound towards money from organizations like the NRA and how much the special interests control our government or people within our government when it's supposed to be a government by the people, of the people, and for the people.
Nada.
Not for the companies and not for the special interest. And so the interesting thing I've been looking at is how much everything seems to be affected by the supply chain issues, except guns. We're having problems with baby formula. Now,
good point, Jonathan.
Have been added to that list. Gas is outrageous things, but guns are all over the place
and going fast. Keep going,
right.
Yeah.
So help me understand that.
Jimmy Kimmel was great last night with Joe Biden. He said, look, I'm going to simplify this. Do an executive order. Don't be afraid of them. And so he said, why do you have rules and regulations if they, quote, are not going to follow it?
Right.
He was great. And, Biden said nothing. I mean, it wasn't too much he could say. He said, I got a wall.
Was Biden on with him last night? Is that what it was? Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
And Kimmel was, but he's very good at that.
Yeah.
He doesn't care about the popularity when it comes to babies.
Right.
Brenda, you mentioned
he almost lost his.
You mentioned Remington. I pulled it up. There's a New York Times article from I think February 15th this year, and it says Sandy Hook families settled with gunmaker for $73 million over the massacre.
Okay.
And the families of Remington, who makes the AR-15 style weapon that was used in the attack at the elementary school in Newton, Connecticut, Sandy Hook, settled for $73 million. And it's the largest payout by a gun manufacturer in a mass shooting case. It's a significant setback, the article says, to the firearms industry because the lawsuit worked around the federal law that protects gun companies from litigation by arguing that the manufacturer's marketing of the weapon had violated consumer law in Connecticut. And I remember something in the news a few days ago where someone showed some commercials of a kid, like a 3 or 4 or 5-year-old, with an AR-15 across his lap or her lap. Did you see that? I'm not sure if that was Remington, but
Yeah,
that was
but it makes
disgusting.
you a man.
Yeah. So I think that might have been the way they did it. And I was trying to see if
Wow.
it mentioned them going out of business or not. So far, I haven't seen that.
But you have that also happening within Congress. There's the congressperson who sent out, the holiday cards with the whole family holding guns,
Mm-hmm.
and the promotion of that. And what you see a lot of times from the right, it almost seems like they identify more with the shooter than they do with the victims,
Mm-hmm.
because they're so strong on promoting gun and gun ownership and defending that. But what about defending the right of kids to live?
Mm-hmm.
And if the hypocrisy is their stance on pro-life before the birth of a child and pro-choice towards guns after the birth of a child.
Mm-hmm.
It's an inconsistent ethic of life.
Mm-hmm.
If you're for life and you're going to call yourself pro-life, then you have to be there and support the entirety of that child's life. There needs to be resources for the mother. There needs to be resources for the child. There needs to be support that gets them through, medical care that's free. That just go ahead and make birth free. If you're really so strong about life and you think there's all of these open pieces that don't get covered and don't get filled. And so it makes you wonder, what exactly is the point?
The point is they're speaking out of both sides of their mouth.
There
and
you go.
There is no intent on either side of that to do what's right. No intent to be humane, to be consistent, to be fair. I use this equation, and it's way out in the field, but I think the principles apply. I say, white people want Africa. They love Africa. They just don't like the Africans.
There you go.
And so they talk about freedom. They want freedom theirs. They just don't want our freedom.
Yep.
There's the contradiction. There's the rub. So they're willing to equivocate, to lie, actually, and to act like these things that you've mentioned. If you're about pro-life, right? What about pro-life after the child is born, and systems and processes and relationships and rules that protect life? And you're saying that they go blind, they go silent. And because what's more important is their ability to take a life, to kill a life. And they feel they have the right to do that. And that's what bearing arms represents to them, is the ability to deliver that violence on other human beings, other companies, other cultures. I've said a lot, been listening to Greg Carr and Karen Hunter. And sometimes the language they use, I don't say it shocks me, but we're in for an awakening in how we view and articulate our view of the world. And so to hear a Dr. Greg Carter talk about colonizers, not a term that, and not in a positive sense, it's a negative, it's a pejorative, right? But we've not been encouraged to view that which has been presented to us as world history and American history through a lens that examined the contradiction between the stated values of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and the value that all men are created equal, against the experience of genocide against the people that were in this land, right? How do you hold that contradiction against the contradiction of, while you're framing this powerful and prescriptive concept of political power as an inalienable right, you are holding human beings in bondage. And so our country still doesn't want to face that. And what they are doing, in my view, is enabling and providing the vocabulary, the tool, the frame of reference that frees us from the hesitations that we have, because we are so inundated and so trained in a way of looking that really disserves our own perception of ourselves. We end up being perpetrators of the chauvinism against us and defenders of a point of view that is inhumane, that's inconsistent, and we end up not being able to say what we know and feel in our hearts and our minds, and what our history as we see it, will tell us is true. So I don't know. I think we're moving in a direction, Jonathan, that is going to be called the reckoning. I think that shows up in the energy of young people. And while on the one hand we criticize a lot of the stuff coming out of misdirected, unguided, improperly guided young people, we have to focus, I think, more on the ability of young people to look past the BS and to criticize, and to call out inconsistency, because it's there to not accommodate inconsistency, but to demand that, that's not what you said it is.
Right.
And I'm not taking it. Yeah. What you think?
I think that's exactly right. And I think that shift is going to occur when we stop teaching slavery and oppression as the history of Black and brown people and start teaching it as the history of white people. Mm-hmm. When we go ahead and teach the history of this country, not as pilgrims looking for freedom and coming for the first Thanksgiving and sharing their harvest with the Native Americans, but rather as invaders who came here to colonize, who came here to take over and started parceling out the land that people were already living on as theirs, and built a system on the backs of Black and brown and yellow and red people. And it is a different focus and a different understanding. And it shifts this from being that great nation that built itself up to that nation that utilized and oppressed people in order to establish the positions we have today.
And committed genocide.
And so much more. Rape, mutilation, the kind of traumatization that happened. When you talk about people, we don't even focus in on that. You talk about the Holocaust, and everybody goes to World War II and the Jewish people and the atrocities that were committed against them. But people don't look at slavery as that. They don't talk about the millions of bodies that are on the bottom of the ocean.
I was getting ready to say, jumping off the ship.
Right. Well, not even jumping off the ship. Slave ships that didn't have enough supplies would tie rocks to slaves and throw them overboard, intentionally drown them because they didn't have enough supplies. They were sick. They just didn't want to deal with them.
Unreal.
Millions along the things. And then you get into this institution of slavery that even after slavery was banned, they were still allowed to have slaves. They just weren't allowed to bring them into the country. And so they were breeding slaves. Yep. And so we have been in bondage in this country longer than we've been free. And people don't often realize, when you look at 1619 on up through 1865, and then you look at 1865 to 2022, longer period of oppression. And so how can you expect people to have equality, to have parity, if you're starting that far back? It's like being in a relay race, and for half of the race, one team has to carry the other team because it's that team's track. Well, actually, they stole the track from another team, but you have to carry them for half the race. And then they get down off your shoulders, and you're supposed to both start from that point and keep up. And they're saying, I can do it. Why can't you? I built this. But no, you didn't build this. Here's the foundation that was laid for you by the years of oppression. It doesn't matter whether you own slaves or not. You're getting the privilege that comes from the fact that slavery was an institution in this country that affected every aspect.
Now, in the last comment, Alicia Gibson, Truth and Reconciliation.
Mm-hmm.
She was so good about that. And we need to do that, but they fear that.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want that truth and reconciliation.
No.
I just want to know where the 93 million is. I'm sorry, or billion. We could use it for books for the kids for the summer.
Right.
I'm sorry.
But that's the thing that people are so afraid of. When we start talking about reparations, the idea comes, oh, we're giving free money to Black people. Oh,
Yep.
we shouldn't. I didn't own slaves, and you don't think about how much it is woven into our culture. And these are all things you can go if you just go look. This goes back to your point, Al, of reading and research, that the Capitol was built by slaves, that
Mm-hmm.
Wall Street was a place you could rent out your slaves for the day, that there were companies that have started to go ahead and pay attention. We were talking last week about Georgetown going ahead and acknowledging its role and providing scholarships and information to descendants of that. When we're talking about parity, and we're talking about what America is supposed to mean, a place of equality, a place for people to be able to move ahead and do things differently, we're forgetting that we're not all starting from the same point.
Mm-hmm.
And that was an intentional piece. And we still have intentional aspects. The Black home ownership is no different appreciably today than it was in the 60s when it was hitting its lowest point. And yet there are more Black people with money, with resources. We can live in neighborhoods now and things like that. And yet the percentage has stayed the same. And you look across our country, and what the young people are really good at, one, they're not as divided by race and culture as our generations were.
Right.
So we're a lot closer on that and moving past that, which is a great thing. And like you said, they call out stuff. They go ahead and they point towards the injustices that are in the world and calling it what it is. And that's part of what needs to be done. We can't sit around and pretend like, oh, this is just conservative values or MAGA principles. No, it's called systemic racism. It's in our country. We haven't addressed it fully. And that's why it continues to go. You can talk about mental health all you want for the person going into the Buffalo store, but they went there because of racism.
Mm.
This whole myth of white replacement theory is because of racism, because they're so afraid of being held accountable. They're so afraid of the idea of exposing the truth that they're coming up with anything that they can to throw out there. The first and foremost piece, before we treat the white shooter for mental health, which is what generally happens when it's a brown shooter, generally it's, they came from a bad neighborhood, they're angry, they are violent, they're from that. But the first thing that goes to when it's a white shooter is, it must be a mental health issue. We've got to work on that. And we never talk about the mental health within communities of color that has been caused by 400 plus years of oppression. So,
and we don't talk about the idea that they view the perpetrator in the white community as an outlier. But when the perpetrator comes out of our community, it's an assignment to the race that all of us are guilty. Listen, we're going to call it a show right now. Great conversation, Jonathan. Brenda, good to be with you. Good to be together. And I invite people to join us again next week. Tomorrow we do our regular visit with Dr. Bravada Garrett Akantanya and the Healing Circles. That's always good. And for those who are listening or sharing this, we want you to like it, share it, subscribe, and help us build an audience. We had, I think, almost 10,000 people, Brenda, check out the interview we did with Ilhan Omar last week.
Oh, that was
numbers
so
are off
good.
the chart, So we want to figure out how do we keep growing and getting people on the Facebook and the Twitter and the YouTube channels.
Oh, that's so great.
Yeah.
Our
It's really
history.
cool.
Oh,
Yeah.
running to be free. I love that.
All right, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good
Take care.
one.
Take
Bye-bye.
care.